What happens when a strict teacher crosses the line, but her target is no ordinary student? When Adam Carter, a confident and curious boy, speaks up in class, it sparks a chain reaction that exposes years of abuse, shakes the entire school, and transforms an entire community. You won't believe how one brave act changes everything. If you're ready for a story of courage, redemption, and the power of speaking up, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss a moment of this incredible journey. The classroom of St. Helena Elementary School was a place of order, or, as many students quietly whispered, a place of fear. Mrs. Richards, with her meticulously styled hair and piercing glare, prided herself on her iron grip over her students. Her rules were absolute, her punishments swift, and her expectations almost impossible to meet. That morning, the class was discussing the Revolutionary War. The sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the edges of colorful maps and posters, but no amount of light could soften Mrs. Richards' imposing figure as she paced between the desks. Today, she began, her voice clipped and precise, we will explore the economic motivations behind the war. I hope everyone did the reading, as instructed. Adam Carter, sitting in the second row, raised his hand. He had spent the evening poring over the chapter, taking notes and writing down questions. Mrs. Richards glanced at his raised hand with the faintest flicker of annoyance. Yes, Adam, she asked, though her tone lacked any real invitation. I was wondering, Adam began carefully, if the textbook might oversimplify the colonists' motivations. It seems like. Before he could finish, Mrs. Richards cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Adam, that's enough, she snapped. You're derailing the lesson. Just follow along. Adam blinked, taken aback. He had always been encouraged at home to ask questions and think critically. But here, in Mrs. Richards' class, curiosity was treated as insubordination. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to understand, he tried again, his voice steady but uncertain. Nobody asked you to share your theories, she interrupted, her tone colder this time. Save your commentary for someone who wants to hear it. The room fell silent. Adam's classmates looked at each other uneasily, some shrinking in their seats to avoid catching Mrs. Richards' attention. Adam's face flushed, but he held his head high. Understood, he said evenly, though his jaw tightened. Mrs. Richards' gaze lingered on him for a moment longer, as if daring him to say more. When he didn't, she turned on her heel and returned to the front of the room. As I was saying, she continued, the colonists were largely motivated by financial independence. Adam sat quietly, staring down at his notebook. He felt a mix of frustration and shame. Why had she reacted so harshly? What was so wrong with asking questions? His fingers clenched the pen in his hand as he thought back to something his mother had told him the week before. People who make you feel small are often the ones who fear your strength the most. He didn't fully understand those words yet, but in that moment, they gave him a strange sense of calm. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur for Adam, but he couldn't help noticing how Mrs. Richards' eyes seemed to linger on him more than anyone else's. Each time she looked his way, it felt like a challenge, a test of whether he would shrink under her gaze. But Adam didn't flinch. As the bell rang, the students filed out of the room, whispering among themselves about the exchange they had just witnessed. Adam stayed a moment longer, organizing his notes. Adam, Mrs. Richards called out, her voice sharp enough to halt him mid-step. Stay behind for a moment. His heart sank as he turned back toward her. That evening, Adam sat at the dinner table, his notebook closed but his thoughts still swirling. The aroma of his mother's cooking filled the kitchen, but he couldn't focus on the meal. His frustration with Mrs. Richards clung to him like a heavy weight. Everything okay, sweetheart? His mom, Evelyn, asked as she set down a steaming plate of pasta in front of him. Adam hesitated, pushing his food around with his fork. It's Mrs. Richards, he said finally, his voice low. She hates me, Mom. Every time I say or do anything in class, she shuts me down. Evelyn sat down across from him, her expression calm but attentive. What happened this time? Adam recounted the incident from class, describing how Mrs. Richards had dismissed his question and embarrassed him in front of everyone. As he spoke, Evelyn listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When he finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at him thoughtfully. Adam, she said softly, what you're feeling is valid. It hurts when someone in a position of power tries to make you feel small. But you need to remember something important: who you are. Adam frowned. What do you mean? You are smart, kind, and capable, she continued. People like Mrs. Richards, people who try to silence others, they often do it because they feel threatened. Maybe she sees something in you that reminds her of what she's afraid of. Afraid? Adam echoed, confused. Why would she be afraid of me? I'm just a kid. Evelyn smiled faintly. Sometimes it's not about you, Adam. It's about her. But that doesn't mean you should let her behavior slide. You have every right to stand up for yourself, but with grace and confidence. Not anger. Adam mulled over her words, his frustration slowly giving way to curiosity. What am I supposed to do then? First, don't let her make you question your worth, Evelyn said firmly. Second, remember that you're not alone in this. Your father and I are always here for you. Adam nodded, though he still felt uneasy. Do you think she'll ever stop treating me like that? Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. Change is hard for some people, Adam. But sometimes, all it takes is a reminder that actions have consequences. Speaking of which. She paused, as if weighing her next words carefully. I don't think you've ever realized how involved your father and I are with your school. Adam tilted his head. What do you mean? Your father works closely with the Board of Trustees, Evelyn explained. He's been instrumental in funding several of the school's programs, including scholarships and classroom renovations. Adam's eyes widened. Dad's on the board? He's not just on the board, Evelyn said with a small smile. He's one of the lead members. He cares deeply about creating a safe and supportive environment for students. Adam sat back, the pieces falling into place. Suddenly, Mrs. Richards' reaction to him felt different. Did she know who his father was? Did she treat him unfairly because of it, or was she oblivious to the connection? What do I do now? Adam asked, his voice a mix of determination and uncertainty. You keep being yourself, Evelyn said firmly. Ask questions, stand tall, and don't let her intimidate you. If she crosses the line again, we'll handle it. Together. Adam nodded, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. Mrs. Richards might have silenced him in class, but she wouldn't take away his dignity. As he finished his dinner, Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You've got this, Adam. And remember, you're never alone in this fight. That night, as Adam lay in bed, he thought about his mother's words. For the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of standing up to Mrs. Richards in a way that would make a lasting difference. The next day, Adam walked into Mrs. Richards' classroom with a newfound sense of determination. His mother's words echoed in his mind, stand tall, don't let her intimidate you. As the students settled into their seats, Mrs. Richards stood at the front of the class, flipping through her lesson plan. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone had witnessed her sharp words toward Adam the day before. Today, she announced, her voice crisp and commanding, we'll continue our discussion on the Revolutionary War. Open your textbooks to page 154. Adam did as instructed, but his mind was racing. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wouldn't let her unfair treatment slide again. Now, Mrs. Richards continued, who can summarize the economic factors that led to the colonists' dissatisfaction? Several hands shot up, but Adam's was the first. Mrs. Richards' eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on Adam before moving past him. Lisa, she called on a girl sitting 2 rows back. Adam lowered his hand, his jaw tightening. He told himself to stay calm. As the lesson continued, Adam noticed a pattern. Each time he raised his hand, Mrs. Richards deliberately ignored him. Even when his hand was the only one in the air, she would pretend not to see it and ask someone else. By the time the class was halfway through, Adam couldn't stay silent anymore. "Mrs. Richards," he said, his voice steady but loud enough to carry across the room. She froze mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she turned to him. "Yes, Adam." "Why are you ignoring me?" he asked plainly. The room fell silent. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared at Mrs. Richards, waiting for her response. "I beg your pardon," she said, her tone sharp. "You've skipped over me every time I raised my hand today," Adam continued. "Is there a reason for that?" Mrs. Richards' face flushed. "I decide who speaks in my classroom," she said coldly. "And I won't tolerate disruptions." "I wasn't disrupting," Adam replied, his voice calm but firm. "I was participating, just like everyone else." "You're out of line," she snapped, stepping closer to his desk. "If you don't want to follow my rules, you can leave." Adam straightened in his chair, refusing to back down. "I'm not breaking any rules, Mrs. Richards. I'm asking why I'm being treated differently." A few students murmured in agreement, their voices barely audible. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Richards' hand tightened on the edge of her desk. "That's enough," she said through gritted teeth. "We're moving on." But the damage was done. The rest of the lesson passed in strained silence, with Mrs. Richards avoiding Adam's gaze entirely. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Adam packed up his books slowly. Most of the students hurried out, eager to escape the heavy atmosphere, but a few lingered near the door, whispering among themselves. "Adam," Mrs. Richards called, her voice icy. "Stay behind." He approached her desk cautiously, his heart pounding. "What you did today was completely inappropriate," she began, her voice low but sharp. "You disrupted my class and undermined my authority." "I was just asking a question," Adam said evenly. Mrs. Richards leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You may think you're clever, Adam, but this behavior will not be tolerated. Do you understand me?" Adam met her eyes, refusing to look away. "I understand that I deserve to be treated fairly, just like everyone else in this class." Her face hardened, but before she could respond, the classroom door opened, and another teacher peeked in. "Sarah," the teacher said, addressing Mrs. Richards by her first name, "the principal wants to see you in his office." Mrs. Richards stiffened, her composure slipping for just a moment. "I'll be there shortly," she replied curtly. As the teacher disappeared, Mrs. Richards turned back to Adam, her expression unreadable. "You can go," she said tersely. Adam left the room, his heart still racing. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain, this wasn't over. As Adam left Mrs. Richards' classroom, he felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. His heart was still pounding, but he had stood his ground. For the first time, he realized he wasn't powerless. He walked down the hallway to his next class, his classmates' hushed whispers trailing behind him. At the end of the school day, Adam waited for his mom in the school's pickup zone. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves crunched under his sneakers as he paced back and forth. When Evelyn's car finally pulled up, Adam climbed in, throwing his backpack onto the seat. "How was school?" Evelyn asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror as she merged into traffic. Adam hesitated, then said, "I called Mrs. Richards out today." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, keeping her eyes on the road. "Oh. What happened?" "She ignored me all class, even when I was the only one raising my hand. I finally asked her why." Adam paused, watching his mom's reaction. "She didn't like it." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "How did she respond?" "She got mad," Adam admitted. Told me I was out of line and disrupting the class. But I wasn't trying to cause trouble, I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. Evelyn reached over and gave his hand a reassuring squeeze. I'm proud of you for speaking up, Adam. You have every right to stand up for yourself. What happened after that? Adam told her about being asked to stay behind after class and the tension in the room when the other teacher interrupted to call Mrs. Richards to the principal's office. Interesting timing, Evelyn mused, a small smile playing on her lips. I wonder what Principal Hargrove wanted to talk to her about. Adam shrugged. Probably nothing to do with me. It felt like she was still in control of everything when I left. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, but Adam could tell she was thinking. Well, she said finally, it sounds like you're making her uncomfortable. And uncomfortable people sometimes make mistakes. Meanwhile, Mrs. Richards walked into Principal Hargrove's office, her polished heels clicking against the tiled floor. She held her head high, but her clenched fists betrayed her unease. Principal Hargrove, a tall, soft-spoken man in his early 50s, gestured for her to take a seat. His desk was impeccably organized, the only sign of disruption being a single sheet of paper in the center with a list of names. Mrs. Richards, he began, adjusting his glasses, I wanted to speak to you about some concerns that have been brought to my attention. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. Of course, Principal Hargrove. What concerns? I've received feedback from several students and their parents regarding your classroom management style, he said, his tone measured. Specifically, allegations that you are dismissive of certain students and overly harsh with your discipline. Mrs. Richards sat up straighter. If this is about Adam Carter, he's been disruptive and insubordinate in class. I've only been trying to maintain order. Principal Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Adam Carter has a 4.0 GPA, excellent participation in extracurricular activities, and glowing feedback from his other teachers. Disruptive isn't a word I've heard used to describe him before. He challenges me, Mrs. Richards said sharply. He questions the material and my authority in front of the class. Isn't that what we want from students? Hargrove asked, leaning forward. Critical thinking. Engaged participation. Mrs. Richards' face flushed. There's a difference between engagement and undermining a teacher's authority. Perhaps, Hargrove conceded, but I've also received a report about an incident today where he confronted you about being ignored. Her lips tightened. He interrupted the flow of the lesson. Or he felt unheard, Hargrove said pointedly. Look, Mrs. Richards, I'm not here to accuse you of anything. But the complaints are piling up, and this school has a responsibility to ensure all students feel respected and valued. Mrs. Richards' jaw tightened. And what do you propose I do? I suggest taking some time to reflect on your teaching methods, Hargrove said calmly. We'll monitor the situation closely. If these complaints continue, we may need to escalate the matter. Mrs. Richards nodded stiffly, rising to leave. I'll make the necessary adjustments. Good, Hargrove said, though his eyes conveyed lingering doubt. Thank you for your time. That evening, Adam sat at the dining table with his parents, recounting his day in detail. His father, Thomas Carter, listened intently, his face unreadable. When Adam mentioned the principal's office interruption, Thomas's brow furrowed slightly. I'll be making a few calls tonight, Thomas said, setting down his fork. I think it's time I had a conversation with Principal Hargrove. Dad, you don't have to, Adam began, but Thomas raised a hand. Adam, this isn't just about you. If Mrs. Richards is treating you unfairly, there's a good chance she's doing it to others too. This needs to be addressed. Adam looked at his mother, who gave him an encouraging nod. Your dad's right, sweetheart. This isn't just about standing up for yourself, it's about making sure no other student has to go through the same thing. Adam nodded slowly. For the first time, he realized his actions had the potential to create change not just for him, but for his entire class, and maybe even the school, The next morning, Adam walked into the school feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. Word had spread about his confrontation with Mrs. Richards, and as he passed through the halls, students whispered and glanced his way. Some gave him small nods of encouragement, while others avoided his gaze entirely, unsure of how to react. When he entered the classroom, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Richards was already at her desk, her face set in a hard mask of composure. As students took their seats, her sharp voice cut through the murmurs. "Quiet down, everyone. Let's begin," she snapped, her tone harsher than usual. The lesson started, but the atmosphere in the room felt heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath. Adam stayed silent, watching and waiting. He noticed that Mrs. Richards' eyes kept darting in his direction, as if she were bracing herself for another confrontation. As the lesson progressed, Mrs. Richards began discussing a new topic: the role of political propaganda during the Revolutionary War. She moved to the whiteboard and started writing notes in her usual sharp, deliberate style. "Now, can anyone explain the concept of bias in historical narratives?" she asked, turning to the class. Adam raised his hand. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, but she called on him with a tight smile. "Yes, Adam. It's when a narrative favors one side while ignoring other perspectives," Adam said confidently. "Like how some textbooks minimized the perspectives of marginalized groups." A ripple of murmurs swept through the class. Adam's classmates exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement. Mrs. Richards' expression darkened. "That's not the point of today's lesson," she said curtly. "Let's stick to the material provided." "But isn't understanding bias part of analyzing propaganda?" Adam pressed. Her hand tightened around the marker she was holding. "Adam, this is my classroom, and I decide what is relevant. If you can't follow along, perhaps you prefer to sit this one out." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. A few students looked down at their desks, while others leaned forward, clearly intrigued by the exchange. "Mrs. Richards," Adam said, his voice steady, "I'm just trying to participate. Isn't that what we're supposed to do in class?" Her patience snapped. "Enough, Adam," she barked, slamming the marker onto the desk. The class fell silent. Everyone froze as Mrs. Richards took a step closer to Adam's desk. Her face was flushed with anger, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "You're deliberately challenging me in front of the entire class," she hissed. "This is not how you earn respect." Adam sat up straighter, refusing to back down. "Respect goes both ways, Mrs. Richards," he said calmly. Before anyone could process what was happening, the sound of a slap echoed through the room. Mrs. Richards' hand had struck Adam's cheek. The classroom erupted in gasps. A few students jumped in their seats, while others stared wide-eyed at the scene unfolding before them. Adam didn't move. His face reddened where she had hit him, but his expression remained calm. "You're in big trouble," he said quietly, his voice steady. "My dad is on the board." Unbeknownst to Mrs. Richards, one of Adam's classmates, a girl named Emily, had been recording the entire exchange on her phone. Her hands trembled as she stopped the recording and quickly slid the phone into her pocket. Mrs. Richards seemed to realize the weight of what she had just done. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the shocked faces of her students. Her hand, which had delivered the slap, was now trembling at her side. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. No one moved. "Everyone, out," Mrs. Richards said, her voice cracking. The students filed out of the classroom in stunned silence, but Adam stayed seated. He looked directly at Mrs. Richards, his gaze unflinching. "I'm not staying quiet about this," he said before standing and leaving the room. By lunchtime, the video had already spread across the school. Emily had shared it with a few close friends, but it quickly found its way into group chats and social media. Within hours, parents, teachers, and even members of the school board were aware of what had happened. At home that evening, Adam showed the video to his parents. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Thomas's face darkened with anger. This is unacceptable," Thomas said, his voice low and controlled. "She's going to face the consequences for this." Evelyn nodded, placing a comforting hand on Adam's shoulder. "You did the right thing by standing your ground," she said. "We'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Thomas wasted no time. He forwarded the video to Principal Hargrove, along with a strongly worded email requesting an immediate meeting. The next morning, the school was in chaos. Parents flooded the administration with calls demanding action. Students whispered in the hallways, their phones buzzing with notifications as the video continued to circulate. Principal Hargrove called an emergency meeting with Mrs. Richards. When she entered his office, her usual confidence was gone. She looked pale and shaken, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Richards," Hargrove began, his tone grave, "I've seen the video." She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up a hand to stop her. "There's no excuse for this kind of behavior," he continued. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending an investigation." Mrs. Richards stared at him, her face pale. "But there's nothing more to say," Hargrove said firmly. "We'll be contacting the school board, and they'll determine the next steps." As Mrs. Richards left the office, the weight of her actions finally began to sink in. The following morning, Adam sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone. Notifications lit up the screen faster than he could read them. Messages of support from classmates, reposts of the video, and even a few comments from people he didn't know filled his inbox. "Is it still spreading?" Evelyn asked as she poured a cup of coffee, her tone a mix of concern and pride. "Yeah," Adam replied, not looking up. "People are talking about it everywhere. Some of the comments are from students I don't even know." His father, Thomas, entered the room, his phone pressed to his ear. He ended the call with a sigh and sat down at the table. "The school board has called an emergency meeting," Thomas said. "It looks like this is going to blow up much bigger than any of us thought." Adam glanced at him, his brow furrowing. "Bigger how?" Thomas took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Other parents are coming forward. This isn't just about you anymore, son. Mrs. Richards' behavior seems to be part of a larger pattern." When Adam arrived at school, the tension was palpable. Students whispered in the hallways, many of them glancing at Adam as he passed. A few approached him to offer support. "That was brave, man," said Jordan, a senior from the debate team. "What you did, standing up to her like that, took guts." Adam nodded, grateful for the encouragement. He made his way to his first class, trying to ignore the buzz of attention around him. By midday, the school's administration sent out an official email to all parents, confirming that Mrs. Richards had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The message stated that the school was committed to ensuring a safe environment for all students and would take appropriate action based on the findings. Later that afternoon, Thomas attended the school board's emergency meeting. The room was filled with concerned parents, board members, and administrators. Principal Hargrove stood at the front, addressing the group. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Hargrove began. "We've received numerous complaints and witnessed first-hand evidence of an incident involving Mrs. Richards. We are conducting a thorough investigation." One by one, parents began to speak. Many shared their frustration with Mrs. Richards' behavior, recounting instances where their children had been unfairly targeted or humiliated in her class. "She made my son feel like he didn't belong," said Maria Rodriguez, a parent of a former student. "She questioned his intelligence because English isn't his first language." Another parent, James Lee, stood up, his voice shaking with emotion. "She told my daughter that her natural hair was unprofessional. My wife and I complained, but nothing changed." As the meeting continued, it became clear that Mrs. Richards' behavior had been a long-standing issue. Complaints dating back years surfaced, painting a troubling picture of a teacher who had used her authority to intimidate and demean. Thomas stood to speak, his voice calm but firm. This is more than just a single incident. This is about a culture that allowed this behavior to persist. We need real accountability, not just for Mrs. Richards, but for the systems that protected her. The room erupted into applause. Meanwhile, the video continued to spread online, reaching parents, alumni, and even local news outlets. Reporters began to call the school, requesting statements and interviews. The story gained traction, sparking discussions about the role of teachers, accountability, and implicit bias in education. That evening, a group of parents and students gathered at the community center to discuss the situation. Adam and his family attended, along with several of his classmates. The room buzzed with energy as people shared their stories. "I always thought it was just me," said Tasha, one of Adam's classmates. "But hearing all of you, it's clear this was bigger than any of us realized." Adam listened, his chest tightening with a mix of anger and determination. He stood and addressed the room. "If we don't speak up now, this will keep happening. Not just here, but in other schools, to other kids. We have to do something." The crowd erupted in agreement. By the end of the night, the group had formed a coalition to advocate for changes in the school's policies, including better training for teachers and a more transparent process for handling complaints. The next day, Principal Hargrove received a report from the school board's investigation team. It confirmed what many had suspected: Mrs. Richards had a history of complaints at other schools before joining St. Helena. Records revealed that she had been quietly transferred multiple times, with previous administrations choosing to avoid conflict rather than address the issues directly. The revelations shocked the school community. Parents demanded answers, and the local media picked up the story, turning it into a regional headline: "Pattern of Abuse, How One Teacher's Actions Went Unchecked for Years." At home, Mrs. Richards watched the news coverage with a sinking feeling. Her once pristine reputation was in tatters, and her phone buzzed constantly with messages, from former colleagues, parents, and even reporters. She ignored them all, retreating into the quiet of her home. That evening, Adam sat with his parents in their living room, discussing the developments. His father had just returned from another meeting with the school board, and his expression was a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. "They're moving forward with major reforms," Thomas said. "This isn't just about punishing Mrs. Richards anymore, it's about changing the way the school handles complaints and ensures accountability." Adam nodded. "I'm glad," he said. "But I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Ever." Evelyn smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've already made a difference, Adam. You've given people the courage to speak up." Adam felt a flicker of pride, but he also knew the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, to rebuild trust, to create a safer environment, and to ensure that no student ever felt silenced or dismissed again. The Monday following Mrs. Richards' suspension, St. Helena Elementary felt like a school in transition. Her classroom, once rigid and stifling, now sat empty as a substitute teacher filled in. Students whispered as they passed by, some peeking through the door to see if Mrs. Richards might still be there. Adam noticed the change immediately. The tension that had hung over the classroom seemed lighter, though there was still an air of uncertainty. Many students weren't sure what would happen next, or how long the change would last. Later that week, Principal Hargrove announced a new addition to the staff: Ms. Turner, a young, energetic teacher with a warm smile and an approachable demeanor. She had a reputation for fostering open dialogue in her classes and engaging students with her creative teaching methods. When Ms. Turner first entered the classroom, she began by rearranging the desks into a circular formation, creating an atmosphere of equality and openness. "Good morning, everyone," she said, standing in the middle of the circle. "I'm Ms. Turner, and I'm here to make sure this classroom feels like a place where every voice matters." The students exchanged curious glances. It was a stark contrast to the rigid atmosphere Mrs. Richards had maintained. "To start," Ms. Turner continued, "I'd like to hear from all of you. What do you want to learn? How do you think we can make this class better for everyone?" The room hesitated at first, but slowly, hands began to rise. I want to learn history from more perspectives, said Tasha, her voice steady. Not just the ones in the textbook. I think we should have more discussions, added Jordan, another student. It's better than just memorizing facts. Adam raised his hand. And we should feel like our questions are welcome, even if they challenge what we're learning. Ms. Turner nodded thoughtfully at each suggestion, jotting them down on the whiteboard. These are great ideas, she said. Let's work together to make this class something we can all enjoy. For the first time in weeks, Adam felt a sense of optimism. Meanwhile, the coalition of parents and students, led in part by Adam's father, had already begun to push for significant changes in school policy. Their meetings were gaining momentum, with more parents attending each week. At one meeting, Evelyn spoke passionately about the need for transparency. The fact that Mrs. Richards was able to move from school to school without accountability is unacceptable, she said. We need policies that prioritize student safety over institutional reputation. One of the proposals gaining traction was the creation of a student-led advocacy group, where students could safely report concerns without fear of retaliation. Adam, along with Tasha and a few other classmates, volunteered to lead the initiative. Their first step was to organize a forum, inviting students to share their experiences. The event was held in the school gym, where dozens of students showed up, many bringing their parents for support. Adam stood at the front of the room, holding a microphone. Despite the crowd, he felt calm. He glanced at his parents, who smiled encouragingly from the front row, then at Tasha, who gave him a small nod. Thank you all for coming, Adam began. This isn't just about one teacher or one incident. This is about making our school a place where every student feels safe, heard, and respected. He paused, scanning the room. I know it's not always easy to speak up, but today, we're here to listen. Your voices matter. One by one, students began to share their stories. A boy named Marcus spoke about how he'd been made to feel invisible in Mrs. Richards' class. She never called on me, no matter how many times I raised my hand, he said, his voice shaking. I thought maybe it was because I wasn't smart enough. A girl named Elena shared how Mrs. Richards had humiliated her in front of the class when she mispronounced a word. She said, maybe if you spoke proper English, you'd understand the lesson, Elena recalled, tears streaming down her face. As more students spoke, the weight of their stories filled the room. Adam felt a lump in his throat, but he stayed strong, knowing how important this moment was. The forum was a turning point for the school. The administration agreed to implement many of the coalition's proposed changes, including sensitivity training for teachers and a student feedback system. Ms. Turner, inspired by the forum, worked with Adam and the advocacy group to incorporate their ideas into her curriculum. She introduced lessons on critical thinking and bias, encouraging students to challenge the narratives they encountered. Adam and Tasha became leaders of the student advocacy group, meeting weekly with Principal Hargrove to discuss student concerns and propose new initiatives. Their work began to transform the culture of the school, making it more inclusive and supportive. One afternoon, as Adam was packing up his things after class, Ms. Turner approached him. Adam, can I talk to you for a moment? She asked. He nodded, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. I just wanted to say how impressed I am with you, she said, her tone warm. What you've done, not just for yourself, but for the whole school, it's remarkable. You should be proud. Adam felt a surge of pride, but he kept his tone humble. I couldn't have done it without my parents and my friends. It's been a team effort. Ms. Turner smiled. That's what leadership is all about. You've inspired a lot of people, Adam, including me. As Adam walked home that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't known before. The journey had been difficult, but it was worth it. He knew this was only the beginning of what he could accomplish. Weeks after the suspension of Mrs. Richards, the ripples of change continued to spread through St. Helena Elementary. The school was no longer just reacting to the fallout of her actions, it was transforming. Policies had been rewritten, classrooms had become more inclusive, and students felt a renewed sense of empowerment. Yet, one part of the story remained unresolved. Mrs. Richards herself. It was a cold, quiet afternoon when the doorbell at the Daniels home rang. Evelyn answered it, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Mrs. Richards standing on the doorstep. The older woman looked different, tired, humbled, and carrying a weight of regret that seemed almost tangible. "Mrs. Richards," Evelyn said cautiously. "What brings you here?" Mrs. Richards hesitated, clutching her purse tightly. "I need to speak to Adam," she said softly. "And to you and your husband, if you'll allow it." Evelyn's protective instincts flared, but she held her composure. "Come in," she said after a moment. "But I'll warn you, this conversation won't be easy." Mrs. Richards stepped inside, glancing around nervously. Thomas entered the living room moments later, his expression unreadable. Adam followed, his steps slow and deliberate. He stopped a few feet from Mrs. Richards, his posture tall and confident. "What do you want?" Adam asked, his voice calm but firm. Mrs. Richards swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she set her purse on the coffee table. "I came to apologize," she said, looking directly at Adam. "What I did to you was wrong. There's no excuse for my actions, and I'll carry that shame with me for the rest of my life." Adam said nothing, his gaze steady. "I was cruel," Mrs. Richards continued, her voice breaking. "Not just to you, but to so many others. I let my frustration and my own prejudices cloud my judgment as a teacher. And for that, I'm deeply sorry." Evelyn and Thomas exchanged a glance but remained silent, allowing Adam to process her words. "Sorry doesn't erase what happened," Adam said finally. "It doesn't change how you made me feel or what you did to other students." "I know," Mrs. Richards said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to make amends, if you'll let me. I've started volunteering at a community center to help underprivileged students. I've also enrolled in training to confront my biases and become a better person." Adam studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're serious about changing, then maybe it's a start. But it's not about what you say, it's about what you do." Mrs. Richards nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you for even listening." The school community continued to heal in the weeks that followed. The student-led advocacy group, now fully recognized by the administration, launched its first major initiative, an annual event called Voices for Change, where students could share their experiences, propose ideas, and celebrate progress. At the inaugural event, the auditorium was packed with students, parents, teachers, and even members of the school board. Adam, as one of the group's founders, was the keynote speaker. Standing at the podium, Adam looked out at the crowd, his heart pounding. He took a deep breath and began. "When I spoke up in Mrs. Richards' classroom, I didn't know what would happen," he said. "I just knew it was the right thing to do. What I've learned since then is that speaking up isn't just about bravery, it's about believing that things can get better." He paused, his voice steady. "This isn't just my story. It's our story. It's about every student who deserves to feel respected, every teacher who wants to make a difference, and every parent who fights for their child's future." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing through the room. After Adam finished, Tasha joined him on stage to introduce the group's next initiative, a mentorship program pairing students and teachers to foster understanding and communication. The program, she explained, was inspired by the idea that dialogue could prevent misunderstandings and build trust. Meanwhile, Mrs. Richards continued her journey of self-reflection and redemption. She regularly attended counseling sessions, where she confronted the biases and insecurities that had fueled her behavior. At the community center, she worked one-on-one with students, helping them with homework and encouraging their dreams. One afternoon, as she helped a young boy with his reading, he looked up at her and said, "You're a good teacher." The words hit her like a wave, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. Months later, Principal Hargrove called a school-wide assembly to announce the completion of the school's reforms. Among the changes were new teacher training programs, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, and a student feedback system that ensured every voice would be heard. These changes represent a new chapter for our school, Hargrove said. And they wouldn't have been possible without the courage of our students, especially Adam Carter. Adam stood in the crowd, his cheeks flushing as his classmates cheered and applauded. He felt a deep sense of pride, not just in himself, but in the community they had built together. That evening, Adam sat on the porch with his parents, watching the sunset. The air was cool and calm, the kind of quiet that signaled a new beginning. "You've done something incredible, Adam," Evelyn said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Not just for yourself, but for so many others." Thomas nodded. "You've shown everyone what it means to lead with integrity." Adam smiled, the weight of the past months lifting. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Or without everyone who stood with me." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Adam knew that while the fight for change was never truly over, they had taken a giant step forward. And that was a victory worth celebrating. This story isn't just about one student standing up to a teacher, it's about the ripple effect that courage can create. Adam's journey shows us that even in the face of injustice, one voice can inspire a community to unite, change, and grow. It's a reminder that no matter how small you feel, your actions can have a big impact. If this story moved you, made you think, or inspired you in any way, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about resilience, transformation, and the power of standing up for what's right. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.